Welcome to the South East London Folklore Society. We meet on the second Thursday of every month with all sorts of interesting talks and whatnot. And today I'm going to be giving a talk entitled Gerald Gardner 101. My name is George. This is going to go on for around about an hour or so. He had a pretty spectacular life. So kind of cutting him down to a relatively tight, it's like 50 minutes has been somewhat difficult. So wish me luck, and I'll just get cracking actually. So this here, can everybody hear me by the way? Can everybody hear me? So this is Gerald Gardner here. He was instrumental in bringing the contemporary pagan religion of Wicca to public attention, and he wrote some of the definitive religious texts for Gardnerian Wicca, which is named after him. His craft name was Skyer, and he was born on the 13th of January 1884 into a wealthy upper middle class family in a place called Blundellsands in Lancashire, which is kind of a beach kind of like villagey town very close to Liverpool. But actually Gardner spent most of his childhood abroad away from his family, and he had no formal education at all. In 1900, at the age of 16, he moved to the Far East, where he worked on tea plantations, rubber plantations, and as a civil servant for pretty much his whole working life. He became interested in the local customs of the Malayans, which is now Malaysia, and wrote about their magical practices. After his retirement in 1936, he travelled to Cyprus and he penned a novel called The Goddess Arrives before returning to England. And he settled down near the New Forest just at about the time of the Second World War, when he joined an occult group. It was an occult theatre group called the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship, and through them he was said to have encountered the coven, the New Forest coven, into which he was initiated in 1939. He believed this coven to be the survival of a pre-Christian witch cult, and he felt the need to revive the faith, and he supplemented the coven's rituals with ideas kind of borrowed from Freemasonry. He was a third-degree Freemason. Medieval ceremonial magic, which he very much liked, the writings of Aleister Crowley, who he knew, and he kind of synthesised all of these to form the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca. You can throw in a bit of Robert Graves, the White Goddess, and there you go. He moved to London in 1945, and he became intent on propagating this religion through the publication of a novel, which was High Magic's Aid in 1949, but more seriously with regards to Gardnerian Wicca, with two books, Witchcraft Today in 1954 and The Meaning of Witchcraft in 1959. He was a subject of press interest, and he did court the press, which did cause a little bit of discomfort amongst fellow members of the craft, because they don't necessarily like that much press interest. And the thing about one of the things I certainly encountered when actually looking at biographies of Graves, of Gardner, is what people will report and what people won't report, because the thing about the Wiccan kind of religion is that it's a religion of initiation, so things will be kept opaque unless you kind of learn it through actually being part of it. Now, one of the important things in the 1950s was that Gardner founded a Wiccan group called the Bricketwood Coven, and he introduced a string of high priestesses into the religion. And through that is basically how the Gardnerian community spread throughout Britain and subsequently into Australia and the United States in the late 50s and early 60s. Now, Gardnerian Wicca is probably most popular as a faith in America, actually. What I'm doing at the moment is just kind of like a bit of a superficial kind of biography before I go in a bit deeper. Yes?
Are we allowed to ask questions as you go along?
I'm going to do a Q&A at the end, so we're all good. Thanks for asking. Gardner also became the director of the Museum of Magic and Witchcraft on the Isle of Man, which he ran until his death. It had a different name before the witchcraft laws were changed in the 50s. We'll get onto that. And he's internationally recognised as the father of Wicca, amongst pagan and occult communities. So let's go back to his childhood. So Gerald Gardner was born on Friday 13th of June 1884, and he was the third of 4 children. Gardner's family was wealthy. They had a family firm called Joseph Gardner and Sons, and it was described as the oldest private company in the timber trade within the British Empire. So it was a wealthy family. You could compare that to, let's say, Aleister Crowley, who came from a wealthy brewing company. Crowley's fortunes were significantly larger than the Gardner family. But one of the things about Gardner's childhood, which is quite striking, is how little he actually saw his family. The Gardners employed an Irish nursemaid named Josephine McCombie, who was nicknamed Com. She's there on the right. That's a little Gardner there. And she was entrusted with taking care of the young Gerald. Now, Gerald was asthmatic from an early age, and Com offered to take him to warmer climates abroad at his father's expense to remedy the condition. So, in 1888, so that's when he was 4, they went to the south of France, which you can see at the top there. This is the first globe-trotting bit of his childhood. So they started off here in 1884, and then in 1891 they went to the Canary Islands because of the nice climate there. And this is actually where Gardner first found himself being interested in weapons. He was absolutely fascinated with weapons throughout his life and would collect them. And then they went to Accra, which is in Ghana here. And then after that they ended up actually spending most of their time here. This is Madeira, that was a Portuguese colony, and they spent the next kind of 9 to 10 years on the island. Now, Gardner's first biographer, his authorised biographer, said that his nursemaid pretty much neglected him, and actually these trips were kind of more like kind of manhunts, really. She was quite on the hunt for gentlemen, and so as a consequence, he was just left to his own devices, just illiterate as well. That's the thing which I was really quite surprised about, because so when he's in Madeira, so that would have been from about the age of 8 or so, 8 or 9, he began collecting weapons from the Napoleonic War, but he also learnt to read at about the age of 9. He taught himself to read by looking at copies of the Strand magazine, but throughout his life, his writing was quite erratic. You could tell that he was self-taught. But he was a voracious reader, and one of the books that most influenced him as a young man was by an author called Florence Marryat, a late Victorian author, and it's called There Is No Death. And it was a discussion of spiritualism, and from reading this book he gained a firm interest in the idea of the afterlife. And this is something which carried on through his life, the idea of there being life after death and then reincarnation. As he got older, he started getting more into that. So, in 1900, so he would have been, is it 16? Yeah, 16. He married, his nursemaid, married David Elkington, who owned a tea plantation in the British colony of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And it was agreed with the Gardners that Gerald would live with his nursemaid on the tea plantation, and he would learn the tea trade. He would become a creeper, which would be a trained planter, learning all about the growing of tea. In the first 16 years of his life, Gardner may have seen his immediate family for 2 to 3 months at a time, at any point. In his biographies, there's no speculation at all about why this would be. I mean, I think it's fairly common for wealthy people to be, farmed off to public schools, but to be estranged from brothers and sisters as well. I mean, you could speculate quite a lot on that, but I'll leave that up to you. But anyway, So as a 16-year-old here, learning how to be a tea planter, he spent most of his spare time hunting deer and trekking through the local forests. And he encountered the local Buddhist beliefs, which he found quite fascinating. In 1904, which is when he was 20 years old, his parents and younger brother visited. His dad had bought a rubber plantation called the Atlanta Estate, and Gerald was to run it. And he did. He spent a few months in 1907 on leave in Britain, and he spent a lot of time with some family relationships called the Sergensons. Now, the Sergensons told Gardner that his grandfather Joseph had been a practicing witch and had been converted to the practice by his mistress. And then he also learnt on this trip that he had a Scottish ancestor called Gerald Gardner, who had been burned as a witch in Newburgh in 1610. I mean, this is actually from the Berwick-on-Tweed witch trials, this print, which is a little bit earlier. But it would have been, if that was the time, it would have been a witch trial under James VI of Scotland or James I of England. Back in Ceylon in 1910, Gerald Gardner was initiated as an apprentice Freemason. Now, it's quite interesting to see that the first few degrees of Freemasonry, it's referred to as the craft, which is something within the Wiccan faith, is something which you refer to the faith as. He entered into the second and third degrees of Freemasonry within the next month. He really was very enthusiastic about it, but it seems to have waned as quickly as it came on. He resigned from the lodge in 1911. The Atlanta estate, the rubber plantation that he was managing for his dad, failed, and that left Gerald unemployed in 1911. So he moved to Borneo. Map time. So there's Sri Lanka over there. This is Borneo here. This is pretty much where Gardner spent all of his adult life. He would dot back to the UK and Europe, but he spent most of his time here. But this is Borneo here. He gained employment in Borneo as a rubber planter, and he became friendly with many of the locals, including the Dayak and Dusun people. There they are. Gardner was fascinated by the indigenous way of life, particularly the local forms of weaponry, and he was also intrigued by the tattoos that the Dayaks had, and pictures of him in later life. I do have a picture of him where you might be able to make out tattoos on his arms. He did have snake and dragon tattoos on his forearms. He was really interested in the local religious beliefs, and he told his first biographer that he attended Dusun seances and healing rituals. He developed malaria and felt that he'd be better off in Singapore. And Singapore is here at the bottom of what was then known as British Malaya. I think it's Malaysia now. He arrived in Singapore in 1911-ish, and he took a job working as an assistant on a rubber plantation. And he actually supplemented his income by buying his own one. He bought a rubber plantation which is like about 100 acres or so. But in 1916 he was keen to do more for the war effort in the Great War, so he actually travelled back to Britain, to Liverpool, where the family home was, and he volunteered in the local hospital, and he actually would be treating returning casualties from the Somme. He did try to join the British Navy, but he wasn't allowed on grounds of ill health. Now, it says here his malaria returned and he had to stop volunteering, but at the same time there's a common thread, which is whenever he comes back to Britain and he stays at the family home, he's only able to stay there for approximately 2 to 3 months before he develops an illness and has to go. So it's quite... I'm going to have a little bit more of a look in on this, because there doesn't seem to be very much comprehensive biographical detail at that time. So he returned to Malaya that same year. Gardner's mother died in 1920, but he didn't return to Britain for the funeral. In 1921, there was a catastrophic fall in the commodity prices, and Gardner lost his plantation, and he returned again to Britain in what's quite likely to have been basically a begging mission to ask his father for money, who didn't give him any money. And he returned to Malaya to find that he had been fired from his other job. So he found work as a civil servant, and he was a civil servant for the rest of his working life. He was in the offices of customs in 1923, and he inspected rubber plantations. And then he, in 1926, he was placed in charge of monitoring the shops which sold opium. And there is evidence indicating that Gardner probably took quite a few bribes in this position and earned himself a small fortune. In 1927, so you're looking at, he's kind of into his mid-30s now, kind of early 40s. His father became very ill with dementia, and Gardner decided to visit his dad. And on his return to Britain, Gardner began to investigate spiritualism and mediumship. Now, he was pretty critical of a lot of what he saw when he went to seances, but he did encounter several mediums who he believed to be genuine, and he had several encounters with who he believed to be the spirits of deceased family members. And on the 28th of July 1927, a medium made contact with a deceased cousin of his, and this was like a watershed moment in his life when he really firmly believed in life after death. And actually, that very self-same evening, he met the woman he was to marry. Oh, there she is. That's a rubber plantation, by the way. This here, sorry about the quality of the photo, but that's the only one I could find. This was Dorothea Frances Rosedale, known as Donna, and she was a relation of his sister-in-law, Edith. So he met her on the 28th of July and proposed to her on the 29th of July, and they married on the 16th of August at St Jude's Church in Kensington. They honeymooned for 2 days at Ryde on the Isle of Wight, and then they went to Malaya. During his time in Malaya, Gardner became much more interested in local customs and folk magic and weapons, and he witnessed quite a lot of magical practices performed by the locals, and he readily would advertise that he believed in the magic. And he wasn't only interested in magic and anthropology, but also in archaeology. And he did do some digs. He had to do the digs in secret because the local indigenous dignity and royalty, for some reason they felt that archaeology was akin to grave robbery, and they didn't really like it. But he still managed to display an exhibit on the early history of Johor at the National Museum of Singapore in the late 20s. And by the 1930s, he certainly began to think of himself less as a civil servant and more as a folklorist, archaeologist and anthropologist. He's starting to migrate away from that kind of idea of work and thinking much more as a folklorist and somebody who believes in belief. And in fact, en route back to London in 1932, he stopped off in Egypt armed with a letter of introduction. I just thought this particularly grand picture of Sir Flinders Petrie, and he actually joined a dig excavating in Palestine, and that's my future look when I'm an old man. He arrived in London in August 1932, and he attended a conference on prehistory and proto-history at King's College London, and attended at least 2 lectures which described the cult of the Mother Goddess. And he also befriended at this time and went to a few digs in Devon with this gentleman here, Alexander Keeler, and modern James Bond lookalike, He's brilliant, Alexander Keeler. He was a practicing pagan, an archaeologist, and he basically bought a lot of the area around Avebury, and it was instrumental in re-erecting the stones. Here are the stones in Avebury as they were falling down. Keeler is the guy who found the barber underneath the barber stone, and when Keeler died, he sold the land. The land was bequeathed to the National Trust at agricultural prices, so for a peppercorn amount. So thank you, Alexander Keeler. That's a really nice thing to do. Anyway, back to Gerald Gardner. I digress. Back in the Far East, Gardner's main interest became this. This is the Malay Kris blade. It's a ceremonial and magical blade, which he chose to spell as Keris, K-E-R-I-S. And he collected 400 of these, and he was always talking to the locals about their magico-religious uses. He decided to author a book on the subject called Keris and Other Malay Weapons, and it was published by the Singapore Progressive Publishing Company in 1936. And it was well received in literary and academic circles in Malaya. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the William Burroughs version of Hacks and a Witch Cult, which is actually soundtracked by a band not dissimilar to this. So just imagine that I'm an English William Burroughs and this is part of the presentation. So, in 1935, Gardner's father died and left him a bequest of £3,000. I looked this up. The modern equivalent of £3,000 is around about £200,000 in modern money. However, with that and the money that he had made through various means as a civil servant in Malaya, he actually took early retirement in 1936. So he was kind of in his, I guess he must have been in his 50s at that point. Gardner wanted to stay in Malaya. He really, really loved the climate. But Donna did not want to stay. She wanted to go back to Britain. So back to Britain they came. But they actually went via Palestine, where he went to some archaeological excavations in Palestine, and he particularly got interested in a temple which contained statues to both the male deity of Judeo-Christian theology and also the pagan goddess of Ashtoreth, which we see here, otherwise known as Ishtar. From Palestine, Gardner went to Turkey, and Greece, and Hungary, and Germany on a bit of a grand tour, and then he eventually reached England. But he soon actually went to speak at conferences in Denmark about the Keris. He returned to Britain, and he found that the climate made him sick. And he registered with a doctor called Edward A. Gregg, who recommended he try nudism. Now, nudism is a big thing for Gardner. That's as far as the picture goes, which is a small mercy. I attempted to see whether we could see tattoos on his arm. I think you might be able to see a tattoo on his right arm there. It does look like there is one there. I have to say, it's been incredibly good fun actually researching Gardner. He does come across as a very kind of warm character. He seems like a really nice guy. Anyway, hesitant at first to be a nudist, he first tried an indoor nudist club, which is called the Lotus League, and it was in Finchley, North London, where he made several new friends, and he felt that the nudity cured his ailment. Now, there was a picture of the nudist club where for some reason they were all playing ping pong, but I left that out. There were quite a few notable kind of great and good people in the nudist club, including the keeper of prints and drawings at the V&A and the curator of the Department of Ethnography at the British Museum. And actually, in his time in nudism across his life, he would meet quite many people in the kind of I guess they would become the neo-pagan movement. He didn't like the cold of the English winter, so in 1936 he decided to sail to Cyprus, and he visited the museum Nicosia, and he studied Bronze Age swords, and he actually successfully hafted a Bronze Age sword, and he wrote an exciting paper called The Problem of the Cypriot Bronze Dagger Hilt, which was actually well received in archaeological circulars. But he didn't have any qualifications himself, and in 1937 he felt this gap quite keenly. So he applied for and received a doctorate of philosophy from the Metacollegiate extension of the National Electronic Institute. That's an organisation based in Nevada that was widely flagged by academic institutions as offering invalid academic degrees via post for a fee. And it subsequently referred to himself as Dr. Gardner from now on. He had planned to return to Palestine to attend further digs. He really did enjoy going on archaeological digs, but the lead archaeologist got murdered, and he thought, I don't want to go to Palestine anymore. So he didn't. So he decided to return to Cyprus. And he had a bunch of really vivid dreams whilst he was there. He really believed in reincarnation at this point, and he believed that he had lived on the island once before and had a previous life there. He actually bought a plot of land in Famagusta in Cyprus, planning to build a house there. He never did build a house there, but he kept the plot of land, and that comes up later in the story. Influenced by his time in Cyprus and also by the vivid dreams he had, he started writing his first novel, which is called A Goddess Arrives. Just have a sip of water. In a nutshell, this novel is about an Englishman who lives in 1930s London called Robert Denvers, who remembers a previous life as a Bronze Age Cypriot. And he's a prince, and the Queen Dionis practices different types of sorcery in order to defend Cyprus against the Egyptians. He returned to London in 1938 and immediately started volunteering in Hyde Park, digging shelter trenches as part of the build-up to the war. And he also volunteered as an air raid warden. He volunteered pretty much throughout the Second World War in different capacities. He was never able to do any particularly active service by this time because he was older and also not in the best of health. Fearing the bombing of London, Gardner and his wife moved to Highcliffe. So London's up here. There's the Isle of Wight. There's Poole Harbour. This is Bournemouth. I grew up there, it's really nice. And this is Highcliffe here. That's Highcliffe Beach there. It's kind of a picture postcard place. It was very suburban at the time. Quite well-to-do, quite middle class, a lot of it. And he came across a building which described itself as the first Rosicrucian theatre in England. Now, this is it here. It was really, really massive. It was built with private donations to the person who organised it, and it was the idea of this theatre was to broaden the cultural minds and enrich the locals. But pretty much from its inception, it had very little. Nobody wanted to go to it, partly because the plays weren't very good, but also because people just wanted to go to the cinema. So they actually, before they closed this cinema, they ended up just showing Laurel and Hardy. But that's got little to do with Rosicrucianism, which is Rosicrucianism is an early modern kind of occult order whereby initiates will help make a better world through magic, basically. Gardner decided to attend one of the plays in August 1939. He attended with his wife Donna. Donna was an amateur dramatist, and she thought the play was rubbish. But Gardner thought there was something in this group who were in charge of the running of the theatre. They were called the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship, and he began attending meetings with them. The Crotona Fellowship was founded by this gentleman here, George Alexander Sullivan, and I think that a daughter of Annie Besant was involved with the fellowship as well. So this fellowship was based on a blend of Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, which was at that time a big religious movement, Freemasonry, and also things that Sullivan here made up. Kind of all moved. This all started up in Liverpool, but moved to Christchurch in 1930. The mayor of Christchurch and the editor of the local magazine were always going on about how absolutely fantastic it was, and there's loads and loads of newspaper articles about how brilliant the theatre is, but nobody ever went to it. It's almost as if they all went to the same lodge. As time went by, Gardner started to become a bit more critical of the Rosicrucian order's practices. Sullivan's followers claimed that he was immortal, and previously had been Pythagoras, Cornelius Agrippa and Francis Bacon. There's also a belief that there was a lamp hanging in the corner of Sullivan's house, which was in fact the Holy Grail. Gardner's dissatisfaction with the group grew, particularly when, in 1939, one of the group's leaders sent a letter out to all of the members saying that the Second World War was not going to happen and you shouldn't worry about it. And the very next day, Britain declared war on Germany, which really didn't impress Gardner very, very much. Alongside being in the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship, Gardner had actually joined the Folklore Society in 1939. And he actually submitted an article into the Journal of Folklore, and I'm going to have to look this up, which was, he had a box of witchcraft relics which he believed had belonged to the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins. He wrote an article on that. At this particular time, Gardner joined the air raid precautions as a warden, which he did throughout the war, and he wanted to join the Home Guard, but they wouldn't let him because he was already an air raid warden. He couldn't be two things at the same time. So he said he'd become the weapons specialist, an armourer for the local Home Guard, and he spent an inordinate amount of time making Molotov cocktails. He was really, really into Molotov cocktails. The thing was, although he certainly was starting to get, starting to be very sniffy about the Rosicrucian order. There were some people within the order, members who kind of kept themselves to themselves, that he found himself drawn to. And he really liked them. And there's a really good guy who wrote this book, Philip Heselton. This book here is particularly about this phase in Gardner's life. He theorised that this group consisted of this person here, which is Edith Woodford Grimes, who will go on to be known as Daffo later on. Somebody called Susie Mason and her brother Ernie Mason and Rosetta Fudge. All of these four people, so Daffo, Susie Mason, Ernie Mason and Rosetta, they'd all come from Southampton before moving to the area around Highcliffe when they joined the order. They were co-Freemasons, but they seemed to have a real interest in the occult as well, which is what attracted Gardner to them. It feels like, and Gardner was very, very fond of these four people. He remarked that he had gone through hell and high water, even then, for any one of them. In particular, he became close to Woodford Grimes. Woodford Grimes was actually an elocution teacher and drama kind of coach. That was how she made the money. But anyway, Gardner got very close to Woodford Grimes, Daffo, and she actually helped Gardner edit his first book, Goddess Arrives. After a while, they let these four people let Gardner know that they were actually witches, and they took him to this house here, which was owned by somebody called Old Dorothy, or Old Dorothy Clutterbuck. Dorothy Clutterbuck was a very, very wealthy local woman, and she was, part of the Conservative Association and everything else. But according to the legend, he was made to strip naked and taken through an initiation ceremony in this room here, because that bit there's a convertible. Just there. Halfway through the ceremony, he heard the word Wicca, and he recognised this as an Old English word for witch. He was already acquainted with Margaret Murray's theory of the witch cult, as many people would have been, because there was Margaret Murray had written a best-selling book about the witch cult. And then he goes, I knew then that which I had thought burnt out hundreds of years ago still survived. The group were known as the New Forest Coven, and he believed them to be one of the few surviving covens of the ancient pre-Christian witch cult religion. In Q&A I can tell you a little bit more about Margaret Murray's theories and stuff like that. Hutton, Ronald Hutton, the Bristol historian who's done a lot of work on this, he theorises that this New Forest Coven may have only been in operation for 10 years or so. Philip Heselton has a different opinion on that matter. The thing is what we're starting to get into at this point is foundation myth for an entire religion. So it's kind of like, I suppose that's the thing. When you're starting to think about what people believe and stuff like that, I think you have to kind of tread in a respectful way. Anyway, Gardner, I'm saying that, but I'm just about to go on to the only kind of magical operation which Gardner describes in detail, which the New Forest Coven did. You find this quite a lot in biography of Gardner, that it seems to be quite light on details here and there, and that's partly because of the way that the Wicca works, where things will be kept hidden unless you're part of a group. But he describes this thing called Operation Cone of Power. The New Forest Coven, as Gardner reports it, had been going for many, many years, and actually when there was a threat of Napoleonic invasion a few hundred years before, they had done a magical ritual which had kept the Napoleonic fleet from invading Britain. And they were, Gardner was really, really worried about the German invasion. So they all went to meet at a particular point in the New Forest. Everybody stripped naked, and they created what was called a cone of power. It was a cone of energy which was to be transmitted over into the heads of German high command. And the message was just simply, you cannot cross the sea, you cannot cross the sea, you cannot come, you cannot come. They were naked, it was cold, so most of them were actually had rubbed kind of goose fat and insulating onto them. There was the idea that in order for this ritual to work, there would have to be a sacrifice of some kind of human sacrifice. So some of the older members of the coven volunteered to not be wearing any goose fat, and actually they caught a chill and died. It was later reported by Gardner that it was not only this coven who was doing it, but there were other covens along the south coast which were doing similar things jointly and severally at the time. But that's the Operation Cone of Power is very much part of the kind of foundation myth of Gardner's initiation into the craft and journey into it. Whilst Gardner was living in the south, though, in the New Forest, he would regularly go back to London because he really liked going to his nudist club. He used to go to one called the Spielplatz Nudist Club. And he befriended, so that's Dorothy Clutterbuck there. He befriended this guy. Hiya. This is Ross Nichols, who he later introduced Nichols to the pagan religion of Druidry, and Nichols would become very much enamoured with the Druidry, as you can see here, and he founded the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. As we kind of graduate out of World War II into the late 40s and early 50s, you certainly find that Gardner's in a kind of an occult soup. He's meeting all sorts of occult figures in kind of close proximity and in time. Following the war, Gardner decided to return to London, and he moved to Bloomsbury in kind of 1945-ish. And he was still very much interested in nudism, and he bought a plot of land in Hertfordshire, a place called Bricket Wood. And this plot of land would be known as 5 acres. And he was one of the major shareholders in the nudist club there. And also, at this time, he befriended a Christian mystic called J.S.M. Ward, who made this thing called the Abbey Folk Park, Britain's oldest open-air museum. J.S.M. Ward was a Christian mystic of kind of the old Catholic Church, kind of like quite hard to understand, apart from the fact that it's an idea of what Christian would have been practiced like pretty much in the 10th century. I think that's pretty much what he was looking at doing. J.S.M. Ward was made bankrupt because he was sued by the parents of a 16-year-old girl who had wanted to join his abbey, and they said, "You've kidnapped our girl," and he had to close his folk park. And actually, Gardner had an eye on something in the folk park, which was this. This is a 16th century cottage. And Gardner said, "Look, I know you're bankrupt, but how about I swap my land in Cyprus for this witch's cottage?" So that's what happened. So J.S.M. Ward moved to Cyprus to live on the land which Gardner had bought. J.S.M. Ward promptly died. But this became the witch's cottage in the nudist colony in Bricket's Wood. And in midsummer 1947, Gardner held a ceremony in the cottage as a form of housewarming. And it's probably a ceremony based on kind of 18th century magical rites, using a Book of Solomon, which he'd acquired at the time. Gardner was very much interested in esoteric things of all sorts. He had real Catholic tastes, and he seemed to be trying out a lot of these things at this time. And in 1946, he was ordained as a priest in the ancient British church. This is a different church to J.S.M. Ward. A fellowship open to anyone who considers themselves a monotheist, which I find kind of confusing, bearing in mind that the Wiccan faith is kind of duo-theist at least. But anyway, that's Gardner for you. Gardner also took an interest in Druidry, and he joined the ancient Druid order and attended the annual midsummer rituals in Stonehenge. And he was actually elected to the Council of the Folklore Society in 1946, and he gave a talk on art, magic and talisman there. Whilst Margaret Murray got on very well with Gardner, Catherine Briggs, the folklorist, really didn't like his fraudulent academic credentials very much. In 1946, Gardner also joined the Society for Psychical Research. He's trying everything at this moment. And then on May Day in 1947, Gardner's friend Arnold Crowther introduced him to... So good, you've got to have two pictures of him. Aleister Crowley. And Crowley had founded the religion of Thelema in 1904, and also had basically been brought into the Ordo Templi Orientis. And shortly before Crowley died, he elevated Gardner to the 4th degree of the OTO, and issued a charter decreeing that Gardner could admit people into the OTO. And this charter was written in Gardner's handwriting but signed by Crowley. In 1947 to March 1948, Gardner and his wife toured the USA to visit relatives who were in Memphis, and also because Gardner wanted to go to New Orleans and look at voodoo. And during that voyage, Crowley died, and as a result, Gardner considered himself to be the head of the OTO in Europe. But actually, he lost interest in OTO fairly soon after this. He stayed in touch with the European and American OTO, but actually it was around about this time that he decided that it was time for him to actually bring more of his ideas with regards to witchcraft and found them into some kind of doctrine. And he hoped to spread it. He started off with this book here, High Magic's Aid. This is a novel, and look, he's using his craft name there, Sky. It's set in the 12th century, and it includes scenes of ceremonial magic based on the Key of Solomon. It was published by the Atlantis Bookshop in July 1949. Quick plug, I've got the Saturnalia celebration on the 10th of December at Atlantis. It's all free. We're going to sing pagan carols. It's going to be really good fun. Anyway, back to Gardner. Gardner's manuscript had been edited into a publishable form by the astrologer Madeleine Montalban. At this time as well, he'd got a scrapbook which he called Ye Bock of Ye Art Magica, which he wrote down a number of Wiccan rituals and spells. This would prove to be the prototype for something which he later termed the Book of Shadows. This is an idea whereby you have a book and you collect the spells and the herbology from your coven, and you write it down yourself or you copy it yourself. The actual name Book of Shadows might have come from Ross Nichols, actually. Nobody's claimed dibs on it or claimed credit for it. I mean, Gardner wasn't that kind of... He's not an egomaniac on the level of someone of like Crowley's size or anything like that. He's very much more of a, dare I say, a cuddly figure. I really like Gardner, he's really nice. But anyway, Gardner also met this guy here. This is Cecil Williamson. Gardner was giving a talk at the Atlantis Bookshop. That's the Atlantis Bookshop. There's Geraldine.
Yeah,
there's Barley. Yeah. Williamson was an influential neo-pagan warlock, and he was intent on getting his own museum devoted to witchcraft. And the result would be this. This is on the Isle of Man, and this is the Folklore Centre of Superstition and Witchcraft. It was opened in Castletown on the Isle of Man. It had to be called the Folklore Centre of Superstition and Witchcraft because the Witchcraft Act, which was a law, hadn't been relaxed. And if it had been called a Museum of Witchcraft and a Museum of Witchcraft, they could have been prosecuted. The whole point of the Witchcraft Act from the 18th century until the kind of mid-20th century was to prosecute frauds. At that point, legally in Britain, witchcraft did not exist, but people who professed to be witches could potentially be frauds. So that's what the Act was. Eventually, the Witchcraft Act got stopped, particularly due to lobbying from Winston Churchill, who was a believer in the occult and wanted it to be relaxed. But that's why it was called the Folklore Centre of Superstition and Witchcraft. Gardner and his wife moved to the island, and he took up the position of resident witch because he didn't give a monkeys. And actually, on the 29th of July, the Sunday Pictorial published an article about the museum in which Gardner replied, "Of course I'm a witch, and I get great fun out of it." Now, the museum was not a financial success, and the relationship between Gardner and Williamson deteriorated. I've actually got, at the end of this presentation, which you're welcome to have a look at, I've got the original guide to the museum, which is really interesting, actually. In 1954, Gardner bought the museum from Williamson, who returned to England to found the Museum of Witchcraft, which settled eventually in Boscastle in Cornwall. Has anybody here been to the Museum of Witchcraft? Yes. It's brilliant. It's bigger on the inside. It's ace. Gardner renamed his museum the Museum of Magic and Witchcraft and continued running it up until his death. Let's see what I've got here. Oh, there's a few pictures of it. You can see the magician's room and the witch's room there. There he is in, yeah, that's the magician's room there. Now, he also acquired a flat near Shepherd's Bush at this time, but he would always go to warmer climates during the winter, where his asthma would not be so badly affected. From his base in London, he'd very often like to go to Atlantis Bookshop. Atlantis Bookshop was one of his favourite places to go, where he would bump into people like Austin Osman Spare and Kenneth Grant. And in 1952, he started a correspondence with this lady here, Doreen Valiente, yeah. And she eventually requested initiation into the craft. And though Gardner was hesitant at first, he agreed that they could meet during the winter at the home of Daffo, Edith Woodford Grimes. Valiente got on very well with both Gardner and Woodford Grimes, and having no objections to either ritual nudity or scourging, which was something which High Magic's Aid, his novel, talked about a lot. And he was initiated by Gardner into Wicca on midsummer 1953. And she went on to join the Bricketwood Coven, and she soon rose to become the High Priestess of the Coven, and she helped Gardner to revise his Book of Shadows, very much taking out the rituals which were based on kind of Crowley ritual, kind of starting to inch those away and kind of go more into the way that Wicca is. In 1954, Gardner published this book here, a non-fiction book, Witchcraft Today, which contained a preface by Margaret Murray, who had published the Witch Cult in Western Europe. In this book, Gardner not only talked about the survival of the witch cult, but also, and this is something which Margaret Murray had as well, that the belief in fairies in Europe was due to a secretive pygmy race that lived alongside other communities, and also that the Knights Templar had been initiated into the craft. And alongside this book, Gardner began to increasingly court publicity, going so far as to invite the press to write articles about the religion. And many of these turned out to be quite negative press for people of the cult. And Edith Woodford Grimes, Daffo, who was like the first person he met and was initiated into the New Frosted Coven, she really didn't like this, and this is when she really started to back away from being in a relationship with Gardner. Woodford Grimes denied to the press, pretty much to her death, that she was involved in witchcraft, even though she was. So you get articles in the 50s like "Witches Devil Worship in London," and other ones accusing him. I've actually got some film footage of his interviews at the time, which we'll play in a second. Just so you know, we're very, very near the end now, so you're doing very good. Gardner continued courting publicity despite the negative articles that many tabloids were producing, and believing that only through publicity could more people be interested in witchcraft, so preventing the old religion from dying out. And he actually published we'll get to that. He actually published another book called The Meaning of Witchcraft in 1959. Now, in 1960, his official biography was written, which is called Gerald Gardner, Witch. And it was credited to a member of one of his high priests, a guy called Jack L. Graceling. But it was in fact written by this guy here. This is Idris Shah, who is a prominent Sufi mystic. One of the things that Idris Shah did was bring about a widespread understanding of the different Nasruddin folk tales. But Shah did not want to confuse his Sufi followers by showing how familiar he was with Wicca. So he insisted on actually saying that, basically publishing it under somebody else's name. In May of 1960, Gardner travelled to Buckingham Palace, where he enjoyed a garden party in recognition of his years of service to the Empire and the Far East. But soon after that, very, very sadly, Gardner's wife died. And once again, he started to suffer very badly from the effects of asthma, which does seem to have a very strong, in his case, nervous thing to it. The following year, 1961, Idris Shah and Gardner travelled to Mallorca, and they went on holiday with Robert Graves, whose book The White Goddess was starting to very much influence the Wiccan movement. In 1963, Gardner decided to go to Lebanon over the winter, and whilst returning home on the ship, the Scottish Prince, on the 12th of February 1964, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the breakfast table. This is what happened at the printer yesterday when I was trying to print it. Just at the place where he dies, it got chewed up. I don't know. Anyway, he was 79 years old. He bequeathed his artefacts and his museum to one of his high priestesses, Monique Wilson, and she sold the whole lot to Ripley's Believe It or Not organisation in America. Ripley's took the collection to America, where it was displayed in 2 museums before being sold off in the 1980s. Boom. Gardner had also left parts of his inheritance to Patricia Crowther, Dorian Valiente, Jack Bracelin and Louis Bourne. And Jack Bracelin, the actual Jack, not Idris Shah, kind of inherited the Five Acres Nudist Club and was the full took over as the full-time high priest of the Wiccan coven at Bricketwood. Now, this is pretty much where the story ends, but Gardner only married once to Donna, and nobody really says there's any difference to that. He did have close relationships with people like Dafoe and certain certain priestesses, but there's no actual evidence of him having affairs. Nobody's really said anything. He really liked sunbathing. Just thought I'd mention that, and he had tattoos. He liked to comb his beard into a barbiche with his hair in 2 little horn-like peaks. That was one of his favourite things to do. He was also a supporter of the Conservative Party, and he was a member of the Highcliffe Conservative Association, and he was a Daily Telegraph. But the thing about him really is there's few figures in esoteric history who can rival him for his dominating place in the pantheon of pagan pioneers, which is alliterative, but it's also true. That's the news of the world, saying what he did there. There's the meaning of witchcraft. That's another picture there. I'm just going to play this, because this is... see how I can make this work.
As we weren't able to produce any fairies, we found a self-professed witch instead, Dr. G.B. Gardner, sweeping the crossroads near his home in Castledown, placing the dust in a shoe in which it's taken indoors, is done to simulate sweeping away continuous bad luck. These superstitions are typical. Many fishermen will still cancel a fishing trip if they see a red-haired woman or a cross-eyed man. In a tiny island 30 miles by 10 miles, there's a whole world of beauty, interest, and enchantment.
And that's Gerald Gardner. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, I think if